Hi everybody out there, Mr. Gilbert and
Mr. Kimpton.
here we're going to do a little bit about geologic time for you today. And we're going to start with how geologic time is organized. And Mr. Kimpton's going to kick us off.
All right, there's a number of ways to organize geologic time, and the most common way is through using four different sections or organizing it as if it were a book, which Mr. Gilbert will talk about. The first way is you start with the largest division of geologic time. That's called an eon.
So if geologic time of Earth were a book, this would be like the chapters dividing big segments of time, eons.
And then we take those eons and we break them up into what is used probably the most, and we'll talk about the most, which are eras.
And if the Earth's time were a book, we would take the chapters, the eons, and divide them into eras, paragraphs. So paragraphs getting smaller.
And then we take those eras, and those eras each have, and it depends on the era, a different number of periods embedded within them.
And if it was a book, these would be sentences. The periods would be like a sentence inside of a paragraph, an era, inside of a chapter, an eon.
And then, if you were to really get specific, and if you take geology in college, they'll take those periods and break them into epochs. Or some people say epochs, but you can decide how you want to say it. They're not used that often unless you get really specific.
And it would be real small, like a word within a sentence, within a paragraph, within a chapter. So geologic time is a lot like reading books.
Imagine that.
So let's talk more about the Earth's four major eras. And technically we're giving you a little baloney right now because there's only 3 eras, but we're going to lump in an eon as an era. So the way to remember them, you don't know them yet, but just remember them, is by the little moniker. Pre's pal is me C. And that's right here on the board. We'll highlight it for you. Pre's pal is me C. And that would be the Precambrian, the oldest, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And these would be the orders from the beginning of, or the eras from the beginning of history right up until the present. And of course, you can see all this put together. You can go online and find a bunch of resources to show you different ways of dividing things into the different eras and periods, epochs, etc., etc. But we're going to hit some highlights for you.
All right, so the way this is set up is using the law of superposition. Precambrian is down on the bottom, so we're actually going to talk from the bottom of the page up to the top, because that's how the rocks get stacked up unless you mess them up. So up at the top, you'll see it says today equals top equals youngest. Whether we've taught you that part yet or not, here we go. So the Precambrian, which means before Cambrian, that's approximately 90% of Earth's history, the first 4 billion years or so, and that's primarily the planet formation and very primitive life was starting towards the very end of that, right before what's called the Cambrian explosion. I'll let Mr. Gilbert talk about that.
So about 570 million years ago, we find a lot of fossilized life explosion at the beginning of the Paleozoic. And I mean, life is going nuts. It's growing all over the place. Many single-celled organisms are cruising around, etc. And it's called old life. There's invertebrates. There's hard skeletons like clams, shells, trilobites, things that we're going to find fossil hunting, which I'm not going to tell you about. And as it keeps going on, life is starting to get crazy. Life cruises into land, and we get some amphibians and plants and crazy things. And then wham! At the end of the Paleozoic, we get a big extinction. Probably the biggest one we know of on record. And that kind of gets rid of a lot of life. About 90% of all life ends in the fossil record. And it begins the Mesozoic era. And that is kind of like freedom for a lot of species that were living under the panic and tyranny of other species. And Mr. Kimpton's going to get us into the Mesozoic.
The Mesozoic. Meso means middle, and it, like the Paleozoic, ended in a mass extinction. So you could think of the Mesozoic as the middle of 2 mass extinctions. There's a lot of M's there, so that's a way to remember it. It's also the age of reptiles, which is probably the coolest time on Earth besides right now with us. And it's also broken down into what you're probably familiar with and have heard of the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And if you want to know more about those, we can give you some links of how to get there. But this is when reptiles really took control of the Earth and were super dominant at that time. Until the end, when the leading theory right now is that a large asteroid impacted Earth and pretty much changed the climate significantly, so much that too many of them could not adapt in time to survive. Now I'll let Mr. Gilbert talk about the Cenozoic.
And with a lot of the reptiles and big carnivores out of the way at the end of the Mesozoic, kind of a lot of these animals and creatures that were smaller, could maybe live underground or make their own nests, took over. And therefore the age of mammals really started cruising around. And some people even throw insects into that. And that's the Cenozoic. It's the last 65 million years of where the Earth went from a relatively, compared to today, more hot environment down to today's more cooler environment, including the ice ages that we've had very recently. And the Cenozoic's just a great time. You and I live here. We live in the Cenozoic today. By the way, if you didn't know, MYO stands for millions years ago. So the Cenozoic started 65 million years ago and is still going on today. And that's it. We hope you enjoyed this event.
Yes, it's been great.
Pre's pal is me C. And that's right here on the board. We'll highlight it for you. Pre's pal is me C. And that would be the Precambrian, the oldest, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And these would be the orders from the beginning of, or the eras from the beginning of history right up until the present.